Welcome back. I'm Sam Kristoff, and for those of you who have been following along, I need to apologize. We have one more setup video before we jump into Unity and start creating some games. And the last thing we need to set up is Git for revision control. Git makes it easy to save different versions of all your files. So if you kind of wreck something, you can go back in time, or if your computer dies, you'll have another copy on a server somewhere. So definitely recommend that you set up Git as part of your game development. Git is one of many revision control systems. It's kind of become the de facto standard with Git and GitHub, especially for sharing open source projects. If you don't want to share your project as open source, you want to keep it closed, if you're going to publish it someday, you can use Bitbucket is a good free alternative to host private repositories. Both use Git as the revision control system. So everything we do here will be basically the same, just slightly different for Bitbucket versus GitHub. First thing we'll do to get started is launch a browser, and we're going to install Cygwin, C-Y-G-W-I-N. And Cygwin gives us a Linux-style terminal on Windows, and it just makes a lot of the Git commands a lot easier. So I'm going to click to go to the main Cygwin page, and in the upper left, I'll click Install Cygwin, and then pick the 64-bit version since I have a 64-bit OS. If you have a 32-bit, it downloads right above it. So I will click the 64-bit version, and that downloads. It's a very small download because it's going to stream most of the packages we need as we install. I'll click to launch the installer, and I'll tell Microsoft that yes, I do want to install it. Click Next, and choose to install from the internet. And then it has you pick the root directory for Cygwin, and it defaults to C:\Cygwin64. And I highly recommend that you leave it to this path. It helps to have a short path with no spaces, and it's really going to pay off in the long run. So I encourage you to leave it there if you can. Then choose to install for all users or just yourself. I'll leave it at all users and hit Next. You choose a place for the package directory. Default's fine here. And your connection type. I'm directly connected to the internet, so that's fine. And then we need to pick a mirror, and this is just a server to download packages from. So for example, we need to install the Git package so we can use Git inside Cygwin. You can pick any of these mirrors. If you are experiencing slow download times, you might want to go through and look for one that's close to you, but I'm just going to pick the top one. We're not installing much, so it really doesn't matter. It'll go and refresh all the packages from the repository, and then you will see a full list like this. Mine was filtered because I've actually done this once before. And if you ever need to change packages, you just run this installer again and you can pick new packages and it installs them into your existing setup. So we just need Git. In the upper left, there's a search box. I'll type Git and it'll filter that list down to just the packages with Git. And in the devel category, you can see Git distributed version control system. That's the one we need, and you'll just have to click bin to install the binary. I already have it installed, so you can see it shows the current version installed, 2.14, and I'll just leave it set to keep that version. All you need to do is tick the little box here. After that, click Next in the lower right, and it's going to download and install any packages, and it'll ask if you want a desktop shortcut. I'm going to uncheck that because I don't like desktop shortcuts really, and I will hit Finish. And now Cygwin is installed. So from here, I just launch the start menu, type Cyg, and launch it. And here we go. We have a Linux-style terminal on our Windows machine. So ls to list the directory, pwd will show our current directory. So we're in /home/Kristoff. That's just based off my username on the Windows system. The other cool thing now that we can do is if I launch my computer and go to C:\Cygwin64, put that on that side, you can see I have home Kristoff. The Cygwin64 directory just looks like a root Linux directory. So I can say home and Kristoff, and you can see here my home directory. I typically create a Git directory in my home directory and then another folder under that for each organization that I contribute to. So I have one for work, one for personal projects, and I'll create another one for the games that I'm going to create here. So you could do that either in Windows or in Cygwin, whichever you're most comfortable with. So I'll just say cd, mkdir for make directory, and make one called git. And you can see when I do that, it showed up in Windows there. And then I'll cd git to change directory, go into the git directory. And then I'll make one called Christoph for these projects. And I will enter that directory. So cd Christoph. And now you can see my path is my home directory, git Christoph. Over here, I can go and get Christoph. And you can see that there's nothing there yet. So now I find the easiest way to set up a new repository, especially when you're using GitHub, is to just go to GitHub, create the repository, and then clone it down to your system. That way you don't have to add the remotes and things like that. It's just a little bit more straightforward. So let's go ahead and do that. Jump back over to my browser and browse to github.com. If you don't have an account, go ahead and create one. I already do, and I'm signed in. Once you're signed in, you should see this green new repository button in the lower right, or upper right. You can say create new and choose new repository. So a repository is typically, you can think of it as like a folder for each project. So typically you'd create one repository per project. So for example, I'm going to create a tic-tac-toe game. So I'll create one repository for that game. If I was going to start another game, I would create a new repository for that one. You can have as many repositories as you want on GitHub if they're open and open to the public, and you can also pay to have private ones. I'm happy to share this with everyone, so I'm going to make this a public repository. So all I need to do is type in a name. I'll say tic-tac-toe. And it's typically good practice to use all lowercase and dashes instead of spaces. There's a lot of opinions on naming conventions, but eventually this is going to be a folder on in our file system, and it's a lot easier to type if you don't use capitals or spaces. Next, I can give it a description. I'm going to say Sam's tic-tac-toe game. Then I can choose if I want it to be public or private, and I'll just leave it to the default of public. I can check to initialize it with a README. A README is typically a file that you put in the root of your repository that just tells users how to use your code. So I'll have it initialize that. It'll just create that file with a default template. And then I have two more options. The first is if I want to create a git ignore. A git ignore tells Git to ignore files. So for example, in Unity, every time we build, we're going to generate all these temporary files for the build process and then spit out an executable that's going to change every time we run. We don't want those checked into our source code. Those are just temporary files. So we would tell Git to ignore those. Otherwise, we're going to get hundreds of copies of these every time we check in. So we're just going to tell Git to ignore all of those. And the cool thing is GitHub has pre-built git ignore files. So I can click the drop down, search for Unity, and choose the Unity one. So this is a pretty good start for all Unity projects. We can customize this file later if we need to. Last is the license. And a license basically just tells other people how you want them to treat your project if they're going to consume your code. So I'll click the drop down. I typically choose an MIT license. It basically says, you can do whatever you want with this code. You should give me credit and don't hold me liable for anything. It's just use it at your own risk. It's a pretty open and forgiving license, so that's typically what I choose. You can choose whatever makes sense for you there. Then finally, I'll click Create Repository at the bottom. So now I have a repository, and you can see at the top, it's samchristoff/tic-tac-toe. The URL is always github.com/ your username or organization, and the repository name. So this is how you can share this repository with other people. And by default, it created my git ignore, my license, and my README. Right now this repository exists on the Git server and nowhere else. No one's cloned it yet. It's not on my local PC yet, and it needs to be for me to develop. So what we do to get it down on my computer is called cloning. So in the upper right, you can see this green box that says clone or download. I'll click that to drop it down, and it's going to give you the path to this repository. So I'll click the button to copy that, and then I'm going to jump back to Cygwin, and I'm in the directory that I want to pull this project into. So I'm going to say git clone and then enter the URL. And in Cygwin, you can hold shift and insert to paste what you've copied. So git clone and then the repository URL. I'll hit enter, and Git is going to clone down that repository, and it's going to clone it by default into a folder with a repository name, so tic-tac-toe. So if I say ls, I can see that directory. And I'll just pull that up over here as well. And you can see I now have a tic-tac-toe directory with my README and my license and git ignore. So now we have a local version of the repository. We can start adding and changing files, and then we can push those up to GitHub. So let's do that real quick. If we look back at the GitHub window, you can see here's my README, and it just defaults with the project name and that description that I entered while I was creating it. But I'd like this project name to actually be capitalized and have spaces rather than the short name that I put for the title. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to click on the README, double click it to open it, and I have it open in VS Code by default. And I'm going to replace tic-tac-toe with a capitalized tic-tac-toe. I'll save the file and close it. And now if I jump into Cygwin, I can say git status, and that's going to show me the status. Oh, it's not going to show me the status. I'm not in the repository. I'm in Git Christoph, and I need to cd tic-tac-toe to go into the repository. Now if I say git status, it'll show me the status of all the files. So basically what's changed from the last commit to the current state, which is called my working directory. So the only thing that's changed is the README, and it says the README has been modified. And that's good. I made that change, and I want to commit that change and then push it up to GitHub so that other people will see the change as well. So the first thing we need to do is add files to our stage list to be committed. So we pick the files that we want to include in a commit. So I'm going to say git add readme.md, and then if I do a git status, you can see that we now have changes to be committed, the readme.md, because we added that to our commit list. So we've now staged files for commit. Let's actually commit them. We do that by typing git commit, and that is going to bring up your default text editor where you can enter your commit message. There's a lot of good information online about how you should format your commit messages. Typically, they should be less than 80 characters wide, so they fit on one line. They should use the imperative case. Just go read online and kind of learn more about how to make good commit messages. At the end of the day, if you're just getting started, this is for you. It's so if you need to go back to, I broke something, I need to go back to a previous version where it worked, you're going to be looking through these messages. So just do something that works well for you for now. So I'm going to hit I, since I'm in Vim, I'm going to hit I for insert, and then say update README. And then to save that in Vim, I hit escape, :X, and enter. You can change that so you don't have to use Vim to edit the text files for commit messages. I typically use Nano, so we'll probably set that up later. But that's it. My commit is complete. And if I say git status now, you can see that I'm on the branch master, and I'm ahead of origin master. That's GitHub. GitHub is the origin. I'm ahead by one commit. That's because I made some local changes. I committed them, so I recorded that point in history, and I haven't pushed them up to GitHub yet. So they're only available on my computer. Let's change that. Let's push them to GitHub. So to do that, I'll say git push, and it's going to ask me for my GitHub username. So I'll use the same credentials that I logged in online with. And then after I put in my credentials, you can see that it is compressing the objects, pushing it to the remote, and then that's it. It all worked successfully. So now when I say git status, it'll say my branch is up to date with origin master, and there's nothing to commit. My working tree is clean. So everything now on GitHub and on my computer are totally in sync. So if I jump back to the website, github.com, refresh this, you can see tic-tac-toe is now capitalized. My changes have been committed, and you can see there are two commits. One when I created the repository, and now I just made another one. The cool thing is I can browse back through those. So if you ever need to go back in history, you can just come here and see what happened between the previous version and this version. And you can go pull chunks of code if you need to, which is super helpful. The other thing is, if your computer dies, you just come here and grab this. Or if you're working on two computers, I have a desktop and laptop, and maybe I want to work on the same project. GitHub and just Git in general makes this super easy. So now we've got Git set up. We've got a project folder set up. We can create a Unity project in this folder and start developing. So next video, we will actually fire up our Unity project and start playing around with the Unity environment. If you have any questions or comments, post below. And if you have video ideas, let me know. I'll be happy to make them for you. Thanks.